Hey AP Micro. This is the Factor Market 2014 AP exam free response question. I'm going to go through the question. I'm going to show you how to best answer it to make sure that you can get the most detailed answers possible, and also for you to help as a review as you start looking at the factor market information. So let's go ahead and get started. So Raise Stable is hiring workers in a perfectly competitive factor market for unskilled labor, right? So now we're going to be focusing. The reason what's important about this is this part right here, where it says it's a perfectly competitive factor market. So as we've talked about before, the factor market is either can be perfectly competitive or imperfectly competitive. So this one is a perfectly competitive factor market. So we're going to look at what it looks like to answer questions A, B, and C. So the first thing is, it says A is looking for us to use side-by-side graphs. So it wants us to do side-by-side graphs for the equilibrium wage and quantity for unskilled labor. And really what we're looking at here is, if we can get rid of that, and we'll come back. And what we're really looking at here is side-by-side graphs for the labor markets, and then also Raise Stable. So we're going to be looking at two different types of graphs. It's the graphs. It's the industry curve, and then also the curve just for, or the graph just for Raise Stable. So that's what we're going to focus on. So it's looking at two different things here. These two, it wants the equilibrium wage and quantity. So whenever it says this, folks, you really need to be thinking about, it's looking for the profit maximizing. So remember we talked before about profit maximizing is where MRP equals MRC in the factor market. So it wants us to get the wage and quantity for the labor market, and we're going to identify those as WE and QE. And the second thing is, it wants to do for Raise, the same thing for Raise Stable, and then we're going to identify it as WR and QR. So let's go ahead and clear these. Let's go on to a blank screen. So, excuse me, if we look at part A, it wants us to do two different things, right? So it wants us to do the industry curve first, right? So this is going to be wage, and this is going to be quantity, right? Quantity that we're going to be hiring. And remember a couple of key things right away. The downward sloping demand curve, or I'm sorry, a downward sloping marginal revenue product curve. And so that's going to be consistent for both of these. So here's one, here's another one, here's wage, here's our quantity. And this one over here on the left-hand side, this is the industry. And then this here is for Raise Stable. So you'd want to make sure when you're graphing these side by side that you properly identify which one's which. So the other thing, next thing you do, we have to get the, I should get in this demand and marginal revenue product. And the next thing we want to be able to do is add in our supply curve, right? So the supply curve is just that upward sloping supply curve, because the supply, remember that supply curve, guys, represents the actual laborers in this market. Okay, so this is what it's a simple supply demand, and it wants to identify the WE, which is over here. This is the WE, and here is the quantity, I do believe, of E. That's what it was looking for. And let's go back and see if that's really, yeah, WE and QE. So here we go. And now it wants to do the same thing for Raise Stable. So remember, since this is a perfectly competitive market, that means that we have thousands of these laborers there's too many of those laborers to make a difference. And so what it also means is that the supply curve, they are going to be a wage taker. So you want to get your supply curve, it's going to be perfectly elastic. And remember, since your supply curve is perfectly elastic, that means your marginal resource cost is also going to be perfectly elastic, and it's going to be equal to it. And I think it asks us here, we want to label it WR and QR. So here is WR, and then we go right down here, and this is QR, right? So that's part A, right? So that's part A. Now, let's go back and look at the next question. It says, is the marginal factor cost of unskilled labor for Raise Stable greater than, less than, or equal to WE? And what we're really trying to figure out here is it's basically asking us the difference between WE and what this marginal resource costs. Now, it did say, if you go back here, it says marginal factor cost. And I get the fact that It's maybe a little bit different, but remember, marginal factor cost is the same thing as marginal resource cost. It's just a different way of saying it. All right, so if you're going to answer part B, what you're looking for is you're going to say that they are the same. And what I would do is I would explain it and say that it is the same due to the fact that this is a perfectly competitive labor market. The raised stable is going to have is going to be a wage taker, and so is taking the wage from the industry. And when you have a wage taker, that means that the supply curve is going to be perfectly elastic. And when you have a perfectly elastic supply curve, the total cost is increasing by the same exact amount for every single unit of labor hired. And so what that means then to you is that hence the supply curve or the wage set by the industry is the same exact thing as MRC. So really to simplify this, folks, to simplify it, what it's looking for B, you're going to say that the WE is equal to MRC, and you're going to explain why it is. And remember, what we just said here is you really want to talk about the fact that since it's a perfectly competitive labor market, you want to make the wage equals MRC because it's a perfectly competitive labor market, meaning that the supply curve, they're wage takers, right? They're wage takers, and they have zero wage making ability, right? So they have zero wage making ability. And if they have zero wage making ability, it means that that the total cost is increasing by a constant wage. Thus, marginal resource cost equals supply. So that's really the rationale for why the supply curve is the same thing as the wage. Part C. Now it says assume that the government imposes an effective minimum wage for the unskilled labor. It wants to show this minimum wage a few different ways. It says show the minimum wage on your graphs, on both the graphs here in Part A, labeled WMIN. So all we have to do is go up to the top, and I'm gonna go up here and change the font. Here is going to be one, and then here is going to be the other one. And this is going to be our WMIN, because that is your minimum wage. And now, folks, what we're doing is it's going to ask you about your profit maximizing wage and quantity again. So let's go back. We did one. So 2, it says on the labor market graph, show the quantity of unskilled labor supplied in the labor market as a result of the minimum wage, and it wants to label it with QS. So guys, all you're doing is you have this is a price floor. A minimum wage is always a price floor because minimum wage means you can't pay less than that. And so that's where it's a floor. And it's looking for us to do the quantity supplied, which is just where the wage intersects the supply curve. And this is quantity S. All right, so just make sure you're properly labeling this. And that was part 2. Part 3 here is looking at, as a result of the new minimum wage, will the MRP, marginal revenue product, of the last worker hired by a raised stable increase, decrease, or stay the same? So this is, when it says the last worker hired, well, we're really talking about really where that last person is. So right here. And so the last worker hired, well, the MRP was down here. Look at where I just circled that little dot there, where the original QR was, the original wage. Well, that's what the MRP was here. But now with this minimum wage, the MRP is actually higher. And so this is going to be a new quantity down here. And so look at where the MRP is. The MRP is here. And so all it's saying is it's just asking you to say, does it increase, decrease, or stay the same? And the MRP in this case, we would say here, C for part 3. C for part 3 is you could just say it is going to increase. And I don't think you have to say anything more than that. My only rationale for why it's increasing is because your new minimum wage the new minimum wage is actually crossing the MRP at a higher point. And so the last worker hired, which is right here again, that's the last worker hired, that MRP is higher than the last worker hired down here, right? And so that is a factor market sample question from 2014 for what you may see on the AP exam. And this just kind of is a review for what we just did. I will put together another review at some point so you can see what it looks like for an imperfectly competitive labor market. But this has been a perfectly competitive labor market. I am Mark Anderson, and I wish you luck in reviewing.